Good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right. I have to make sure. I was traveling this week and got back from Germany yesterday afternoon, and so I'm a little jet lagged and not entirely sure what I'm seeing or thinking or saying or any of that kind of thing. So just wanted to make sure there were people actually here as we get going. It's good to see you. Hope you had a good week, and we have a lot of stuff to talk about this morning. So let's pray, and we'll go ahead and start and just move on from there. Heavenly Father, we give thanks to you that you have blessed us so richly through the proclamation of your word, and we give thanks to you for the way you have continued to be faithful to your church, ensuring that we, your people, have the gospel, grow up in that gospel, and then carry that gospel to the next generation. Bless our conversations today as we consider the challenges that our church experienced in a really difficult time in its history, yet you were faithful and blessed them. So we ask you, dear Lord, to be with us and bless us, for we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. So, we're getting close here to the end of the story, and I say we're getting close because we're in 1847, right? Which, of course, is the first year the Synod existed, and now that we've been at this for 6 weeks or so, you see just how complicated it is and how much there is to trying to tell this sort of a story, and I just find it remarkable, the many facets that make up the story of something as complicated as a church body. But at the same time, a lot of it's, it comes out of very simple kinds of things. And we didn't spend a lot of time on this particular slide last week, and I just wanted to take a minute to think about it. These are the charter congregations and their pastors at the founding of the Missouri Synod on April 26, 1847 in Chicago. And you'll see, I think I mentioned this in passing, that you'll see sometimes different numbers for congregations. Sometimes folks will say there are 14, sometimes they'll say there are 15, sometimes they'll say there are 16. I have 15 listed here. Part of the reason for that is it was rather fluid at the beginning, because this list of 12 pastors who were there with the congregations that they were serving, of course, there were others that were at the meeting too. Some pastors who were there but didn't have congregations with them, and even some lay representatives from congregations that didn't have pastors at their congregations yet. And some others who were just serving in kind of mission situations, so they didn't have a pastor or a congregation, as it were. So don't get too worked up over the numbers, is kind of my point, because they're working it out at this point in time and building an institution that then they will continue to support and work together via that institution into the future. But there are probably, as I mentioned, about 4,000 members of the congregations that are participant, formally speaking, at the beginning of this thing. But if you added the others who were sort of connected in one way or another, probably another 4,000 or so. And probably another 10 pastors or so, something like that. So it's not an exhaustive list, is the point. But it is interesting to me when you look at the list, and that's on your sheet. It's numbered, slide 2. Some of the things that you see as you look at it. Now, the name of the church body, again, was the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. Well, nobody was going to take all the time to say that right from the beginning. So immediately it's called the Missouri Synod. But if you look at the list, what do you note about the state of Missouri? It's modestly represented, is a nice way of saying it, right? Most of the congregations are actually where? Majority congregations. Indiana. And I bring this up over and over again. I'm not defensive. I'm not hurt. Well, yeah, I am. It should have been called the Indiana Synod, but why wasn't it? Or at least Indiana should have been in the name. Well, because there already was a group called the Indiana Synod. It had been founded already in 1835. Most of its congregations were down in the southern part of the state, southwestern or extreme southern part of the state. So Vigo County around Terre Haute or down towards Louisville. And so Indiana was taken. There was an Ohio Synod, but it had this impossibly confusing name. So we just took Ohio and stuck that into the name. But the primary reason I think for it was that the farthest west congregations were in Missouri. The farthest east, with the exception of the one congregation in upstate New York, Buffalo, were in Ohio. And then there were other states, right? Including Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. But the majority of congregations were here in northeastern Indiana. Of course, those are the congregations that are part of the old mission work that was led by Friedrich Winnekin and then supplemented by people like Wilhelm Seeler and Hussmann and others who play these incredibly important roles in the formation of the Synod. So, keeping that in mind, one little point I do want to make, where are we here? I don't want to shortchange Zion Lutheran Church, as it's put here, in Van Wert County, Ohio. That's almost Indiana. If you've been to Zion Shum, just across the Indiana-Ohio border, you can still visit that founding congregation of our synod. So there, I did my due diligence on that point. It's a wonderful congregation. We'll see a little bit more about them a little bit later today. Now, in the first constitution of the synod, the translation of that, there's a funny little statement at one point. It says, the German language will be used in this synod whenever it meets as a requirement, unless the person speaking is a stranger. Not sure that's probably that's the best translation, but it means you would have visitors from time to time, and those were the only people who were allowed to speak some other language. Otherwise, Cornelia is just loving this at this point. Auslander, yeah. But it was extremely German in perspective. And in a lot of ways that was intentional. If you put it into the larger context of synods that were being formed at this point in time, they were typically formed on the basis of a shared language. So there are German synods being formed, there are Norwegian-speaking synods being formed, there are Swedish Lutheran synods being formed. These are all Lutherans, by the way. Danish Lutheran synods being formed. But in almost all these cases, you have more than one synod being formed that has a particular language. So, for example, with the Danes, I don't remember if I mentioned this or not. There are two Danish synods, and one is called the Happy Danes, and one is called the Gloomy Danes. That's what everybody calls them. So, the Missouri Synod were not the only kind of weirdo Lutherans that were running around. There were plenty of others, and all fun. What strikes me, however, in thinking about this, and there's some of the advisory members, so that gives you a little bit of a feel of some of the other folks who were participants. And there's the first Constitution. We still have that at the Concordia Historical Institute in St. Louis. We bring it out every so often under heavily armed guards, and then we line up and allow people to look at it, and it's good for 10 million years off purgatory if you come take a look at it. That turns into kind of a relic at times. It shouldn't. One of the things that's really interesting to me about this newly formed church body is the emphasis it puts on pastoral formation right from the beginning. And we've already talked about how there's a seminary here in Fort Wayne at the time of the synod's founding, and that's, of course, Concordia Theological Seminary, which was located at the time of the synod's founding just east of town where Indiana Tech is today. That's the campus site. Many of you remember probably the junior college that was there. Earlier than that, what is today Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, which is actually located in Clayton, just west of St. Louis proper, had been formed in Altenburg in December of 1839. So one of the first things the immigrant Saxons did was to establish a little college, a log cabin college, as they called it, and that's what you see, of course, here on the left. In 1849-50, it moved to St. Louis, and they built a building there. That's the first building, which was on South Jefferson Avenue, if you know St. Louis at all, right by where Concordia Publishing House is today. In 1861, they, for 14 years, had the two seminaries operating conjointly. I think that's the best way to put it, even though it's kind of an awkward way of saying it. They remained distinct institutions, but they operated together. So you had the practical seminary on one side of the seminary, and then the theoretical seminary, as it was called, housed on the other side. And they used, of course, this middle building as a common area where classes were taught and that sort of thing. But the reasons for that were the two different curricula for training the pastors. The theoretical seminary was based on the old German gymnasium system and required at least 8 years for a student to complete. And typically, the student would begin his studies when he was 12, 13, maybe 14. But if you got much beyond that, you were considered too old for that track. And so in that case, you would go to the practical seminary, which was 3 years in terms of curriculum. Didn't require as much language study as the theoretical seminary did, but was geared to train students quickly, concisely, and prepare them for active ministry almost immediately. As a result, you might imagine that in the early history of the Synod, the vast majority of pastors that were trained here in America for service came out of the practical seminary. And there were a handful that were coming from the theoretical seminary. As the institution grew, kind of stabilized and expanded, in time that shifted to the theoretical seminary. And that became the more dominant in terms of numbers as the Synod was moving on. But, and all the while, and I should make this point too, all the while, there were also pastors coming in from places in Germany to serve. And there was specifically in Steden, a seminary begun by a pastor where he would train pastors quickly and then send them to the Missouri Synod. And there were about 300 or so that he ended sending up over time. So lots and lots of co-efforts, you might say, in this regard to provide pastoral care. Now, I just have to say one thing here, and that is Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. I was just with my good friend Tom Egger, who's the new president there. He's a dear, dear friend. We work very well together. And I love my colleagues at the St. Louis Seminary. But I always try and have them keep in mind one thing. Their seminary was begun in 1839 in Altenburg. We recognize that, December 1839. Our seminary was begun in October 1846 here in Fort Wayne, so we're younger by 7 years, right? But, again, when the Synod was formed, it requested the two entities that were operating these seminaries to donate the institutions to the Synod. And the man who was operating ours was Wilhelm Lea, who was a pastor in Neuendettelsau, Germany. And he said, sure, here you go. And already in September of 1847, our seminary became Synod's property, and that was recognized officially in 1848 at Synod Convention. However, the folks down in Altenburg said, no, this is our seminary. And they were hesitant to make the donation. And so it took a couple of years. 1849, finally, they said, okay, we'll donate it to the SEM. It moved up to St. Louis at that point in time, and 1850 was formally established as Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, chartered in the state of Missouri, etc., and accepted by the Synod, which of course means our seminary is Synod's first. I'm just reporting the facts. But I did remind Tom Egger of that again this week. just helping out. By 1883, they had built a really impressive building for the St. Louis Seminary on South Jefferson Avenue. So if you've ever been to Concordia Publishing House, just the kitty corner to the southwest is Holy Cross Lutheran Church, and immediately to the south of that was where the seminary building was. And there's one building remaining from the old complex that Holy Cross still uses as a parish hall. But it was rather impressive, wasn't it? I mean, that is really something. Now, think of the year 1883. This is less than 40 years after the founding of Synod that you move to this sort of established institution. The Missouri Synod, in other words, grows fast from this little enterprise of 12 pastors and 14, 15, 16 congregations with about 4,000 members total to, well, we can take a look here. There's Walter. To this particular piece, by 1887, you can see we have 678 member congregations, 746 non-member congregations, nearly 500,000 baptized members, and nearly 1,000 pastors. In a 40-year period, this is just incredible growth in an extremely compressed period of time. And the question I pose to myself regularly on this is, why? Why did it grow so fast? And the simple answer is immigration. And there's a lot of truth to that answer, but it's not enough. Because, for one thing, there are plenty of immigrants we didn't reach, but there are also other church bodies that are trying to reach German-speaking immigrants at this point in time. And yet, the Missouri Synod grows more quickly than any of the other immigrant church bodies, meaning German-speaking immigrant church bodies. It is the fastest growing German-speaking immigrant church body in the last half of the 19th century. Does that make sense? So the point is, it grows fast. And this despite the fact that a lot of people predicted it wouldn't even survive at the time of its founding. Why? Well, because it was small, right? 2, because there are plenty of other church bodies being formed at this point in time that already speak the German language, right? And 3, nobody's going to keep speaking German in America, is the idea. Now, to that point, I like to again, draw a comparison. The Missouri Synod, well, no, I'll back up just a little bit. The Buffalo Synod, which was a group of Prussian immigrants that had come together and formed a synod in 1845, was the first church body to subscribe to the Lutheran confessions in their entirety, unconditionally, founded in America. The year after Buffalo's founded, the Indianapolis Synod is founded. There was an Indianapolis Synod. It was all German-speaking. 1847, of course, the Missouri Synod is founded. In 1850, maybe a little more familiar, what becomes today called the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod is founded. So the Wells, or the Wisconsin Synod, comes into existence in 1850. In 1854, the Iowa Synod is formed. And there's bunches of others. So there are all these German-speaking synods that are formed in more or less the same time. But none of them grows like the Missouri Synod does. Why? If it's just immigrants and just German language, why does Missouri grow? You know, they're all growing like this, and Missouri grows like this. Part of it's schools, an excellent point. To be a member of the Missouri Synod, your congregation is required to have a school in the early history of the LCMS. Now, in many cases, that's an option for churches that form themselves during this period of time. But to be a member of the Missouri Synod, you must have a school. And what does that do? That attracts families to churches. And at this point in time, families tend to be, especially German farm families, kind of big, right? So this is a big part of the Missouri Synod's growth, but it also then connects people to their local congregation, right? and provides them a place for, that they, in which they can grow up and then consider perhaps professional church work service on down the path as a pastor or teacher. Or it gives them excellent training for lay leadership in their local congregation. It's just incredible what this provides for the Missouri Synod, and the impact is inestimable, in my opinion. So that's one. So schools. What else? I've already alluded to another portion of this before, and that is the Missouri Synod intentionally seeks out the immigrants. We don't wait for them to come to us, we go to them. And so we have Winnikin down on the dock with his fellow members at Second Lutheran in Baltimore with their signs for free breakfasts as the immigrants are getting off. And they come to the church, have their meal, but even more importantly than Winnikin and his fellow workers in this regard, connect people to the congregations where they have schools, right? And so they make sure that people don't disconnect from the church as they're making the transition here to America. They're connected to the church. And perhaps even more importantly, they make sure that people that don't have a strong church connection who are coming in now have a community to which they are attached. And that makes, again, that's just a huge part of the reason for the Missouri Synod to grow. There are other reasons as well, but the schools and the intentional outreach that the Synod takes on are hugely important during this period of time. So much so that, well, we'll look in a little bit, but the LCMS will grow, again, well beyond the other Lutheran church bodies, German-speaking Lutheran church bodies here in America. Please. Yeah. Oops. Where'd my stuff go? It's gone. What'd I do, hit mute? What's that? Really? Not. I'm hitting everything. There's the green thing he's going. When in doubt, hit every button repeatedly. Tab. These things are a mystery to me. Well, we'll just talk. So on the sheet, or we saw a little bit earlier, these started coming back. If you look on the non-member congregations, are these unaffiliated congregations that are at some point in moving towards, most often, not always, but moving towards formal membership with the LCMS. Typically, that's a really good question. Typically, these are preaching stations, as we call them in English. And that means what would happen was it was normal for a pastor to have his congregation that he served. Then he'd also very frequently have to serve a vacant congregation that was nearby. But then in addition to that, he would have a preaching station or 2 or 3 or 4 in the area around him that he would go out to during the week to preach at. And again, this is this sort of intentional outreach that the Synod is doing, that the pastors are doing to make sure that these folks who have this tenuous connection to the church can grow into that and then develop that into a congregation that in turn will do what? Start its own preaching station or 2 or 3 or 4 kind of thing. So they're on the way towards membership, but they're not there yet. Yes, please. Go ahead. Yeah, maybe so, huh? Yeah, it's not like they're coming up with some great program or some new way of doing this. They're just sharing the gospel and following the pattern that you see outlined in the New Testament. And they don't think they're doing anything unusual. It's what you do as a Christian. Yeah, exactly. Please. Crank them out, yeah. Yeah. They were old. They were really old, like 18. The question was how old were the older students? They were still tended to be pretty young. There are some instances, how old were the pastors coming out of the theoretical seminary? Typically about 21-ish, something like that. They thought you should be about that age. Could be a little bit earlier, might be a little later, but that was pretty typical. But in the In the other system, because you started later, they wanted to get you in relatively quickly. So it was more or less the same age that you were looking at, maybe a little bit older. And we laughed because we say it's the older students, but they weren't old. And part of the reason for that is, of course, what? Life expectancy was pretty short. Average life expectancy was about 40. The expectancy for a man at this point in time was about 45. So if you're going out at 22, you're got about 20 years, maybe, although many live longer than that. But if you were going out at 35, you got one foot in the grave already. So old. Please. Yeah, good question. Again, did they speak English or did they learn English at the seminary? At both seminaries, there was English language instruction. It was minimal at St. Louis. It was a little more here at Fort Wayne. But it was more for the pastor to be able to function in his community than it was for outreach. And that's going to be one of the big issues ultimately that will lead to the founding of what is called the English Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, as opposed to the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. Because the German Missourians say, we know we need to do outreach in English, but we're overwhelmed with the work we're doing in German, so we'll encourage colleagues to start another synod that will do all their work in the English language. And that's where some of the kind of interesting stories come out. Still not up there. All right. Other questions? No, we'll just turn into question time. Yeah. No. But they did work with other language groups. So, for example, the Norwegian Synod, which was smallish after its founding in 1853, needed a place to train its pastors. And initially, they tried to do it with pastors training other candidates, and you're already having so much work, so is there a way we can do this? Well, they finally decide, we'll train our students at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. The Norwegians do. The problem is, of course, they all speak German, right? So how is this going to be helpful specifically? Well, the deal that ends up being worked out is that the Missouri Synod will provide a professor who can teach in Norwegian. So they expect the Norwegian students to do some work in German, but the seminary says, we'll also do some work in Norwegian, right? So who do they get to do this? Well, remember, the two seminaries worked cooperatively in St. Louis beginning in 1861. And the guy who comes from, Wilhelm Seeler stays at St. Paul, but August Kramer moves with the seminary to St. Louis. Now, August Kramer, I mentioned the other week, can learn any language you throw at him quickly. He's just incredibly gifted in this regard. So they say what? Hey, we need you to learn Norwegian. And he says, okay. And he does it. And so he learns Norwegian to teach the Norwegian students in Norwegian, even though he's a native German speaker, but he knows all these other languages as well. Yeah. So it's more reactive than it is, intentional in this regard, but it's there. I mean, we do that too. Other questions? Yes, please.
So the preaching station model.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, did they call that a circuit rider?
They called it a Reisprediger. Right? I mean, a traveling preacher. Yeah, but it's circuit rider. What we would think of it as a circuit rider, and later on we adopt that language when we adopt English. Yeah. All right, other questions? Low German is German spoken in the lower parts of Germany, meaning closer to the North Sea. Is it? As opposed to High German, Hoch German, which tends, yeah. And that could be a big thing in terms of membership as well. There was a congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio, that required you to, did I tell you this story? Okay. That made it a condition of membership that you only speak Low German in the congregation. You could speak High German at home if you wanted to, but you could only speak Low German in the congregation. And if you kind of did anything out of the ordinary, namely spoke High German, you could be disciplined. Please. Please. Yes, In fact, Concordia Seminary, at its founding in 1839 as a college, and that's still the official name of Concordia Seminary, by the way, Concordia College. When it was founded, it had, I forget how many students, just a handful of students, the youngest of which was about 5 years old and was a girl. So it was a training school, very broadly speaking, and then kind of refined its curriculum over the years into what we think of today as seminary. But first class in the log cabin in Altenburg in 1839. How? 7. Yeah, and the youngest was 5 and was a girl. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yes, please. Sorry. Not in that big building, across the street from that big kitty corner to the northeast of that. Mm-hmm. At the seminary, yeah. Sure. That sounds very typical. And, we think, we have everything organized. We were talking a little bit earlier. Call service is coming up later this month, right? The 20, what is it? Let's see, I knew, but do you know how many hours? Anyway, till then. No days, but not. Things were more flexible at that point in time in terms of pastoral formation. And so there are stories where students will come to, for example, to the St. Louis Sem, it happens here at Fort Wayne too, and begin their studies. And the idea is you're going to go through this whole long thing. But at points, a congregation or maybe a mission will write a letter to the president of synod and say, we need a pastor now. And so the president of the seminary, C.F.W. Walther, will walk into a classroom and say, you're done. You have a call and you're going here. And you can just imagine the student going, I'm not sure I want to do that. Well, he would just kind of come walk up and take you by the arm of your coat and say, come on, you and I, we're going to the train right now. And he put the guy on the train, and with his after they picked up his crate and that kind of thing, and off the guy'd go. And that's the way it worked. It was really quite. Just no wives among the students. No wives at all. This was not allowed. In fact, if it was found out that you had become engaged while you were a student, you were expelled. But you were also expected to be married within a month of your ordination. So there were these miraculous relationships that just kind of appeared, and it happened all the time. The guy would graduate, he'd get ordained the next week, and he'd get married the week after that. It's a miracle. Like I said, quite flexible. Please. Ah. Yeah, sure. To high school. They were the cadets. Yeah, so, right. Yeah, and this is one of the kind of interesting shifts that occurs. The question of participation in military on the part of future pastors. If the preparatory schools have that as a requirement, then all the pastors are going to be trained in some of this, at least the pastors that come through there, and whether that's appropriate or not. And there were some significant questions about that, particularly in the early part of World War I, you might imagine, because we were still a fully German-speaking church when World War I broke out in 1914. And there was a lot of agitation going on within the United States for support for either the German efforts or primarily the English, right? And the stance the Missouri Synod took was neutrality. And so we argued vociferously for neutrality with respect to the European War, as it was always called. Any chance that things? Oh, you're trying to. He's getting the squirrel on the little wheel, running the crank up the energy on that thing. Because there's some really interesting confrontations that occur over this particular point. The Missouri Synod's position with respect to this was to say that's not the church's concern in any way, shape, or form. So one of the elements we took, it's really kind of interesting given our current circumstances. We actually insisted on a firm separation of church and state on this. Now, what that meant was you carried out your responsibilities as a citizen, and the church did its work as church, which was the proclamation of the gospel. And you made a very firm distinction between the two, and thus, when it came to a war that had broken out in Europe, there was not firm consensus on the part of the U.S. population with respect to support. The Missouri Synod said the best thing to do would simply to just stay neutral on this thing. And so there are any number of leaders in the Missouri Synod who take a very, interestingly enough, active role in arguing for neutrality. It's a little ironic. And one of the great ironies is when a professor from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis by the name of Friedrich Benty actually appears before the United States Senate and testifies arguing for neutrality and saying that the position of the U.S. is to remain independent of these European problems, right? So you know the story of isolationism that's at work in the United States during this point in time. The LCMS is isolationist. We'll take care of our own business. If we end up with another civil war here in the U.S., then we'll deal with that. But this is not our war. So just stay out of it. And so Benty, imagine if you will, Benty's there before the United States Senate testifying and citing George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all these great founders of the U.S. against the perspective of the majority of senators. So here's the professor from the seminary who's a native-born German making this argument. Well, it results in a letter from Henry Cabot Lodge, a name you might know, to Theodore Roosevelt, a name I know you know. And Lodge who was a senator at the time, is saying, we had this guy lecturing us on what it means to be an American. And his accent was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. And Cornelius says, what accent? Right. But this really was part of the challenge that the Missouri Synod faced as it adapted to the emerging realities of the English language. Now, talking a lot about Germans and German speaking, the Missouri Synod was never of the mind that you had to speak German in order to be a Christian. Sometimes that sort of idea creeps out. You can't be a really good Christian if you don't speak the German language. That wasn't what they were thinking. Now, they did think you could speak more clearly about Christianity and the gospel in the German language than you could in English. But if you had to make do, you could speak the gospel in English. Their perspective on this was rather, and the insistence on the use of the German language was driven by their very intentional mission strategy. Huge influx of immigrants, many, if not most of them, being lost to the church in that transition. Our job is to reach them. That's the specific job that God has given us as German speakers now. And that's what we're doing, and they did it well. They did it very well. We need others to do this just as intentionally and clearly in the English language. But we don't know English yet. Cornelia.
I have a question now, because you said there's no time from state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
In our INC community, Missourians have different understanding.
Yeah. Sure.
So when did the theology of the Missouri Synod become theology of the Missouri Synod?
So when did the theology of the Missouri Synod become the theology of the Missouri Synod? Or when did our kind of unique perspective on many things emerge? And that's all part of this process as well. That's a very good question. Well, let me answer it a little differently. Why did they start all these German-speaking synods? Why didn't they just form one? Well, because to form a group, you have to be in agreement. You already know the next thing I'm going to say, don't you? Trying to get Germans to agree, or trying to get anybody to agree for that matter, is very challenging. And so you end up with different synods that not only reflect, different geographies, Missouri, Ohio, Iowa, whatever. Not only reflect different geographies, not only reflect different dialects, whether it's High German or Low German, but there are also different theological emphases. And some of those are brought from their homes in the German states, and some of them develop here. One of the biggest fights that occurs early on is between what becomes the Buffalo Synod and what becomes the Missouri Synod. And it happens in the midst of this conflict over Martin Stephan. We can't ever get away from this guy, right? But what happens is, just as the Saxons in Perry County and St. Louis are resolving their conflicts, a letter comes from the leader of the Prussians up in Buffalo, New York, named Johannes Grabau. And he sends this letter and says, we are all agreed in terms of our acceptance of the Scriptures as God's Word. The Lutheran confessions are a faithful exposition of the Scriptures. We should work together. And here's how we should do it. And as soon as he lays down that line, well, and I shouldn't say as soon as, it takes the Saxons 2 years to respond to his letter, which is a little rude, but, when you have as much email as, anyway. So they finally respond when things kind of settle down in their area, and they write back and they say, you're making things required that the Scripture does not. And you're putting all the power in the pastor's hands at the expense of the lay people. And this just starts a huge fight. Now, in the case of the Saxons, everything they hear from Grabau, they interpret in light of Stephan, right? I mean, they've had this terrible experience of this guy who takes over everything in the life of this community and turns out to be a very bad person, right? And so they hear another bad person trying to come in and control them. And so they respond, honestly speaking, relatively gently. But when Grabau gets the response, he's furious because his experience in upstate New York, upstate New York at this point in time is called the burned over district. Ever heard this? Burned over district because revivals have been burning over the district over and over and over again. The great American revivalist Charles Finney has been having his meetings, the tent meetings that are so famous, and everybody's getting converted once, twice, 10 times, this sort of thing. It's wild in upstate New York. And my wife is getting angry at me because she's from upstate New York. But when we were newlyweds, we actually went to the site of Finney's first great revival in western New York, and I caught the largest smallmouth bass of my life right there at the site of the revival. So, I don't know. Anyway, so he's interpreting this in terms of the wild revivals, and where there's no organization at all. And so he hears the Missourians saying, no organization. complete, mob rule. And they can't communicate as a result, and at least effectively. And the result is this terrible, terrible fight where they just keep ratcheting it up. Nobody's going to walk this thing back. They're always going to ratchet it up. And it finally gets to the point in 1859 where Grabow blows his cork and excommunicates the entire Missouri Synod unilaterally. Seriously. At which point, a number of his followers say, maybe the Missourians were right. This guy does think he's the Pope. And they leave the Buffalo Synod and join the Missouri Synod. And the Buffalo Synod continues on. It's always a small group. But that's the kind of thing that results then in the Missouri Synod, articulating a position that is more, accommodating to the American setting, specifically in regard to the way congregations are structured and representation of lay people with respect to the office of the ministry. So that when Walther puts together a series of theses in 1851 on church and ministry that are adopted by the Synod, formally adopted by the Synod, it's this fight from within the American context that does that. And there are a number of those sorts of things that happen. You're never detached from your context. You're always influenced by it, just like we are today, or like we were in 1914 to 18 with arguing for German neutrality in World War I. Can any of you imagine that at this point, making the argument for German neutrality in World War I? Can any of you? You can kind of abstractly, right? But in real terms, what ends up happening to you if you take that position? People say, you're a supporter of the Kaiser. You're anti-American. You should be out. You should be deported. But I've lived here since 1847. You're no American, right? So they start calling Missouri Synod members Huns. That's a church of the Hun, the invading Hun. Well, nobody's invading America, but that's the perspective of those who are trying to uphold the German language. And there are, there are amazing pictures that go along with this. The most pronounced one, the one that always sticks in my head, is a picture of a German soldier bayoneting a child for God and Father. For God, what is it? For God and fatherland. Yeah. And what I tell folks is, this is how your neighbor thought of you as a Missouri Synod Lutheran. Now, what happened as a result of that? Well, Zion Shum. The school is dynamited in 1918, October 1918. People actually set a bomb off at the Lutheran school at Zion over in Wilshire, outside of Wilshire, Ohio. There are, at my congregation that I served my vicarage at in Terre Haute, Indiana, the teacher was accused of being a spy because he was teaching the children in the German language. And we can't understand what he's saying, so we know he's involved in some kind of very nefarious activity. Well, what's he teaching them? He's teaching them the explanation to the first article of the Creed, probably, something like that, but it's in German, so it sounds, horrific to people at this point in time. So they tell the guy, basically, leave town forever, or we're going to tar and feather you and ride you out on a rail. And he leaves town, the school shuts down, and has never reopened. There is a plunge in the number of Lutheran schools at the point when the U.S. enters World War I. Just a plunge. And then there's a recovery, but you can imagine, again, it doesn't take much to imagine. If that's the typical perspective, simply to speak German is to be un-American. So this is Teddy Roosevelt saying what? We don't want any hyphenated Americans. We don't want any German Americans. And that's who it's aimed at. And we go so far as, ultimately, to change the immigration laws in 1921 and 1924. Change the immigration laws to prohibit the Huns from coming in, to keep the Germans out, because we've had these huge numbers of Germans come in. We don't want them anymore. At which point, it's pretty serious stuff, obviously, but a little comic relief, in a way, is provided by our own church body. In 1917, we dropped the word German from our official name. Now, the name is still said in German, but we dropped Deutsche from it. So we're no longer the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. We become the Synod, the Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, or however it would have gone, right? And they think, that'll solve it. We'll just drop the name German, but we'll keep saying it in German. No, it doesn't fix anything. It actually makes it worse in some ways. And so then we say, we've got to change our name. But that'll take World War II to finish that whole argument off. And that will, believe me. But you get it. This is it. Changing your language. How do you change your heart? How do you do that? Does it happen when a government says to you, you cannot speak that language any longer? You have to now speak English. Well, you might do it, but you're going to do it how? Under duress. However, we'd already been talking about this for a long time, and we'd been teaching students in the seminaries English, really at Fort Wayne at least, from the beginning. So there is a recognition of the need for that. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, please.
I just want to make a comment that back when they had went to the churches back December 5th last year, one of the Catholic cathedrals across the street from Zion Lutheran down the street, they found that a couple of years ago they renovated the church, and they found there were plaques under each one of the stations of the cross. They took the plaques off.
It was German. Covered it up. Yeah. So things that were, and that's in Fort Wayne, which is a highly German community. One of the great examples of this kind of, we're no longer that, occurs with the German American Bank here in Fort Wayne. That's bad branding, to use modern terminology, in 1917. What are we going to do? We'll change the name to Lincoln Bank, right? What's more American than Honest Abe? Sure.
Okay. Are you getting in with the English Lutheran Church? Because I know that back several years ago, I'm from the Southern District.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and down there, the English won't say Missouri Center, it just says the English Center.
Yeah, that's just about what I'm going to talk about here.
As against playing against LCMS.
Right.
As far as having congregations. And
Sure. Yep. And I'm going to do that right now in the remaining time we have. So that's right on the mark. Right on the mark. So knowing that there was a need for English, the first significant interaction occurs in 1872 in the state of Missouri at a little town named Gravelton, when a group of folks coming out of the Tennessee Synod, so English speakers, come together with Missouri Synod leadership, Walther is there, and they say, we want to be a part of your church body. And the answer is, you can't. Why? Because you're strangers. You speak English, right? So what are you going to do instead? What you guys ought to do is start an English synod. An English Missouri Synod. And it takes them a little while, but they do in 1889. The English Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states comes into existence. There are a lot of congregations in the South that are part of this church body. Not so many, they're scattered about Louisiana, Alabama, quite a few more in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. They're always small. It's always a small endeavor. But in time, people say, you know what, we're transitioning in the Missouri Synod to the English language anyway. Maybe we should bring these folks in. And there's some negotiating that goes on, as you might imagine, and the negotiations result in the English Synod coming in 1911 as the English district. But they insist that they retain their distinct identity and that they be a non-geographical district of the Synod. So part of that is, you have the historic districts, like Indiana District, which comes along a lot later, but very creatively, the Western District and the Eastern District and the Southern District, and a lot of effort put into this, naming these things. But the English district kind of functions on its own, but it becomes a member of the Synod in every respect as a district in the year 1911. So even before World War I, English language work is recognized, but it's still kind of an anomaly, frankly. But it does bring in a fair amount of literature. There's, for example, work in English language hymnody. Liturgy is brought into the Missouri Synod experience by the English district. And it's really actually a very helpful thing when the Missouri Synod finds itself no longer being accepted as a German-speaking church body come 1918. And then we have to make the transition. So here's the transition. I'll get your question then after that. In 1917-18, about a third of Missouri Synod congregations use the English language in some form. And by 1935, say, 2/3 of Missouri Synod congregations use the English language. So there's still a third that only speak German. But you go from a third to 2/3, a majority, a supermajority, in the span of about 17 years. That is a huge shift. A huge shift. And it's even bigger than those numbers make it sound, because in 1917-18, when you have these small numbers, a third of congregations using the English language, most of those are using English only sporadically. They might have an English language service once a month in the afternoon, kind of thing. So it's any English language usage. But by 1935, 36, English is the majority language in all of those congregations. So it's this massive move from German to English in the span of about a decade and a half. That is amazing. And it is also extremely challenging and uncomfortable, because behind it, there are all these questions of, can we do this? Should we do this? And what will it mean for our future? Cornelia, question or comment?
I just want to say that I live just south of Brussels.
Right, which is an English. Henry Rudisill, way back. Yeah, well, and this goes even farther back, of course, because you had a split at St. Paul congregation in the 1840s, 44, 45, somewhere in that range, when Henry Rudisill, who was one of the lay leaders of St. Paul congregation, said, we want to keep speaking English, and Winnikin, their pastor, said, we're going German with this emerging Missouri Synod, and so it was actually an amicable separation into a German-speaking and an English-speaking congregation. The German being, of course, St. Paul, the English being Trinity English. Yeah. So I could dump a whole lot more on this side of things going way back. But let me just say this real briefly. The first the first congregation formed to use only the English language in the United States was formed in 1806. That late. That's late. The first full translation of the Book of Concord, so the Lutheran confessional texts, being available completely in the English language, that was published in 1851. 4 years after the Missouri Synod was founded. English came slowly to the Lutherans of America. Just was the reality. I saw another hand somewhere. I guess not. Okay, so here for next week then, our last week. Obviously, when we made that move to English, everybody agreed. Nope. And we're still dealing with the fallout from that, not just the English issue, but how do we work through points where we are just basically in disagreement with one another. And it's going to get tough. Next week's kind of a challenging one. But there's hope. There's hope. So God bless you all. Thanks for your attention, and we look forward to seeing you next week.